think in EPSU our starting point has been what does competition do to public services, and we have seen in the internal market pressure to liberalise many public services. Energy is perhaps the best example, where we were promised in Europe cheaper prices, more sustainable energy, more reliable provision, and we've seen, I think, with the energy crisis following the war in Ukraine, that this is absolutely not the case, that the private sector can't guarantee the supply of quality, affordable energy services. And I give that as an example because that's the case for many other public services. If you want good public services, then you have to have public services principles underpin them, and they're about cooperation between actors, they're about solidarity, funding, the spreading of risks, and so from that point of the internal market, when we saw the first, especially the new trade agreements like EU-Canada or EU-US or the Trade and Services Agreement follow a very aggressive liberalisation approach, we realised that this is going to just exacerbate the problems within the EU. And I would say also, of course, as EPSU is part of the global Federation, Public Services International, we're always very conscious of the internal and the external dimensions of trade. So if you looked at the Commission agenda for CETA, for example, their first document talked about the EU having defensive and offensive interests. So more or less realising that they might need to protect something in Europe, but outside Europe they could more or less do whatever was possible to open up markets, and that's just not correct. So problems for public services when you have competition and when you undermine the public services principles that make sure everybody gets access to the service. Well, privatisation is not the same as liberalisation. Many of the pro-liberalisers and pro-privatisers, they say we want just to liberalise, we don't want to privatise, it's up to each member state or each local government if they do privatise. But of course there's a link, because the more you open up to competition, the more you put pressure on public services to become like non-public services, to compete, and then you start to have things like cherry picking, where the market comes in just for certain bits, and where some people say, is a nice way of saying it, you socialise all the risks and you privatise all the benefits, rather than having a more uniform access. Well, yes, I think you can see from what we were saying, our position is in EPSU, and not only in EPSU, that clearly we need to exclude public services, not least because GATS, if you look at GATS, the origin of trade liberalisation, especially in goods and in services, it's progressive liberalisation, the holy grail unto ever, no? And it's only one way. It's very difficult to turn back liberalisation. And so I think here to say that the distinction between trade and trade agreements, no? Clearly they're two different things. Agreements are sort of legally binding, and they block countries and especially sometimes local governments into being more flexible and actually doing what some of the neoliberals always argue when they say why we can't do things at European level on public services. They say, that's because we need to give people choice. But actually they don't give them choice, they only give them choice to liberalise. We need to protect the public services in Europe, but the EU also needs to promote better public services in its external policies. There is a white paper from the European Commission where it does say very clearly that our internal policies should be reflected in our external, and many member states in Europe do have good public services, and they should want other countries to have those as well. So no aggressive liberalisation, There is a debate to be had, can we put more positive things in trade agreements regarding, say, obligations to provide healthcare or energy rather than just open markets. I think for the moment, perhaps we would say, in general, to keep trade maybe to more limited areas, and that what we really need to do is perhaps not so much focus on trade, but focus on all the other institutions and international organizations that we need to beef up. So the WHO, the World Health Organization, the ILO, which are trying to set standards, but often these are not legally enforceable or have less weight than the trade opening. The due diligence, all to do with trying to protect the environment, and of course everything on climate change. And there, I think, perhaps just to end on that point, I saw a Twitter from the Ambassador Tai, who's the USTR representative, and she was talking very much trade context and saying, it's all about a race to the top. But what is a race to the top in today? We had a very nice presentation from Julie at school yesterday, because linked it's Public Services Day today, so I'll have to say that. And she has a very nice diagram which I can share of the long-necked dinosaur. So you have the body, and then this huge neck, and basically it's all the poor people in the world. And then you have a tiny bit more, and then the neck just goes up and up and up to the limit. And you know the figures probably as well as I do, that we have such an accumulation of wealth, not only between countries, but between people and companies, that really trade as a race to the top, I think, doesn't make any sense. We need another type of race against climate change, against poverty, against all the things that we need to tackle.